the public absolutely cleaned up. And we talk about on the show how sometimes people in the gambling space say, oh, always fade the public. They don't know what they're talking about. Well, not all the time. Sometimes the public actually wins. And this weekend, if you look at the most bet teams when it comes to tickets, it was the Chiefs -1.5, an easy winner over the Niners. It was the Giants +3 on the road at the Jags, which we heard all kinds of things like, oh, the Sharps are all over the Jags. And it was also the Jets -1.5, which we also heard things like, oh, don't back the Jets. At some point, they're going to regress. But once again, it's the New York teams leading the charge. And Jenks, I feel like specifically that game between the Giants and the Jags, didn't we hear all week long that, oh, this line kind of looks weird, so you should take the other side? It's time to back the Jags. All the Sharps are on the Jags. Well, the Jags didn't win, and they certainly didn't cover.
I mean, there was a couple games that, and I can't wait to talk with Jason Scott at 8:20 about this, of course, from BetMGM, and he will have all the information as to how the book did. But I'm sure the book crushed when it comes to the Bucs losing. But in most of the games, you're right, Chelsea. We heard, oh, the Jags, this line doesn't make any sense. I'll tell you something. The New York Giants, I watched a little bit of that game just via Red Zone, and the Giants are a fourth quarter team. They do this each and every single week where come fourth quarter, they find a way to grind it out and get ahead. But this was definitely a weekend where the public did really, really well. And this is what keeps you coming back, right? Because if you're a casual bettor, and it's hard to be good at sports betting, and the public side is the public side for a reason. If you're a public bettor, this is one of those weekends where you're probably cashed, and guess what? You'll be back next week because you finally had a winning weekend. I did not.
Right. It definitely wasn't one of those weekends that reeled me in. In fact, it was one of those weekends where I wanted to walk away from the table forever. But, those type of weeks happen too. But I think it's a larger conversation that so many times, especially in sports betting, people just want to look at the numbers and the analytics. And the New York Giants are one of those teams where analytics don't love the Giants. In fact, that they're predicting that the Giants shouldn't be winning these games. But at one point, do you watch the team that's in front of you and you watch this team week in and week out continue to win games in the fourth quarter? Do you think it's a mentality thing? Do you think it's an X factor that should be considered when handicapping your games? Because I remember looking at this game last week and thinking, do I want to trust the Jags again? The team that's cost me in a teaser against the Texans. It cost me against the Colts, even though they had that game completely won the entire time until the last 2 minutes of the game. Do I want to trust that team again? No, I don't. And I don't care what the analytics say. I just don't want to put myself through that. So at what point do you put the eye test over the analytics?
Well, I think you always have to take both into consideration. And for example, if you look at analytics and you say, okay, well, when it comes to the Giants, this is a lucky team. You can actually measure luck in analytics and say, this is a team that is due for regression. And I would take that into account. At the same time, just like winning is contagious and you have to learn to win, sometimes losing is contagious. This is not a markedly different Giants team than we saw last season. Did the Giants make any incredible moves during the offseason? Outside of head coach, I'm talking about players. Did they make any moves? Yeah, they drafted Kayvon Thibodeau, has been a great addition, but did they really do a whole lot in the offseason to make you think, oh, this is going to be a different team? No, but they've learned how to win. They play really tough. They're difficult late in games, and that's something that can kind of be measured, but not completely. You can't measure the confidence of a football team. You can't measure the fight of a football team. And it goes for any sport. So I think you have to take both into account and you say, okay, maybe the analytics don't favor the Giants. That doesn't surprise me. But at the same time, this is a team that fights every single minute. And when it comes to that final quarter, they own it.
And the thing about sports betting is I feel like it's good to look for edges that aren't in the numbers, because isn't that what Vegas is basing their numbers on? Other numbers and analytics.
Yeah.
So if there is some X factor, we see it in college football where there's letdown spots, where there's teams coming off this big win, and then emotionally it's tough to get up for the next game. So I think maybe this is where you can actually find an edge, even though I feel like most people wouldn't agree with me. They'd say, no, you stick with the numbers, and eventually this Giants team is going to all come crashing down. But I don't know. I feel like maybe the answer is somewhere in between.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. And I'll go back to what I said about the Giants at the end of last season because this just goes to show how how much of a different football team this is behind Brian Dable, and he has been the difference. And at the end of last season, Chelsea, it's one of the few times where I relied exclusively on the eye test, and the Giants could not move the football. They were so terrible on offense. I faded the Giants like the last 3 or 4 games of the season based on just watching them. I said, I don't care what the number is. This team can't move the football. They're not going to win. And they were a moneymaker. And that had nothing to do with analytics. It was purely watching the game. But I think for the most part, you're right. The truth is somewhere in the middle. You can't just rely exclusively on one or exclusively on the other because the one thing that analytics never take into account, you cannot take into account emotion and the human factor, right? We're human beings, we're emotional beings. So that's something that analytics, all the numbers in the world aren't going to tell you which team has more momentum or more confidence. Those are things just can't be measured. So you have to take both into account.
Yeah, and then you look at the Giants this week. Once again, they are getting points at Seattle, who's been another surprise hot team behind Geno Smith and that offense. It just keeps rolling. But again, getting the Giants 2.5, I feel like I got to at least throw them in a teaser when they are getting 8.5 points. Yeah, at some point the train's going to stop rolling, but I'm not going to bank on it until it actually happens.